The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly before him, a rolling sea of green and shadow that seemed both inviting and untouchable. Ethan Miller stood at the overlook, his hands gripping the weathered wooden rail as if the timber itself could anchor him to the moment. The crisp autumn wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, stirring old memories he had spent 6 years trying to bury. But today, standing here, he could not deny the truth. The mountains still held his brother. 6 years ago, a group of pilgrims, modern seekers retracing a spiritual trail older than most settlements in Virginia, walked into this wilderness and never returned. Among them was Ethan's older brother Michael, a man full of conviction and restless faith. Search parties combed the ridges, helicopters swept the valleys, and divers searched the rivers. Nothing surfaced. They were swallowed whole, as if the mountains themselves had chosen silence over surrender. Mysteries like these often fade with time. People grow weary of waiting. Headlines vanish from newspapers and communities choose not to remember. But Ethan had never forgotten. He had worked as an investigative journalist for years, chasing stories that often led nowhere. But every assignment seemed like a distraction from the only truth that mattered. What happened to Michael? What happened to all of them? Before diving deeper, let me pause here and invite you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to this channel. By doing so, you won't miss the rest of this story as we unravel the secrets of the sacred trail and the hidden truth one survivor dared to share. Ethan closed his eyes and heard Michael's laughter, strong and unshakable, echoing in memory. He remembered the night before Michael left, sitting on their parents' porch in Richmond. "This trail is more than steps in the dirt," Michael had said, staring at the stars as though they were road signs meant only for him. "It's about becoming part of something older than us. Don't worry, Ethan. I'll come back different, but I'll come back." Those words haunted him because Michael had not come back at all. Ethan's return to the mountains was not sudden. It had been gnawing at him for months. Strange reports whispered in forums, unconfirmed sightings, even rumors of someone from the vanished group being alive. Each fragment felt like a spark in dry tinder until he could no longer ignore the fire building inside him. He had to come here, even if it meant reopening wounds his family preferred to leave untouched. The town at the trailhead hadn't changed much since the days of the search. A scattering of old houses, a diner with chipped paint, and the ranger station that still carried faded posters of the missing. Locals avoided eye contact when he arrived. Some looked at him with pity, others with annoyance, as if his presence threatened to stir a past they had carefully learned to ignore. He rented a small room at a roadside inn, its walls thin enough to hear the television blaring from the next door. The manager, a grey-haired woman with sharp eyes, handed him the key but offered no welcome. "Some things are better left alone," she muttered, not even trying to soften the words. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay awake, listening to the whistle of wind through the trees outside, wondering if Michael had heard that same song before vanishing. He scribbled notes in his journal, piecing together the timeline, marking names, rereading old articles he had written in the weeks after the disappearance. Every fact felt hollow now, drained of meaning. What mattered was not in the papers. It was buried deep in these mountains. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would start asking questions again. Tomorrow, he would walk the trail his brother had taken. But tonight, he listened to the mountains breathe, steady and patient, as though waiting for him to step into their silence. And somewhere in that silence, Ethan sensed the beginning of something he could neither resist nor escape. Ethan woke to the faint glow of dawn, spilling across the thin curtains of his rented room. The hum of distant traffic mixed with the steady trill of morning birds, a reminder that life outside the town carried on as usual, indifferent to the ghosts clinging to this place. He sat at the small desk, his notebook open, and wrote a single line: "The trail remembers everything." The words weren't fact, but a feeling, the kind that pressed against his ribs whenever he thought about the disappearance. He left the inn and walked through the quiet streets. Locals went about their routines, men sipping coffee outside the diner, women hanging laundry in backyards, but their eyes followed him with guarded suspicion. He knew why. He wasn't just a stranger passing through. He was a reminder of a tragedy they would rather not revisit. The sacred trail had once been called simply the Settler's Path, a narrow route carved through the Appalachian wilderness by early colonists in the 1700s. But long before that, it had been a path used by Native American tribes, a route tied to sacred grounds and ancient rituals, To them it was more than a passage. It was a line between worlds, a space where respect and restraint mattered. Settlers ignored the warnings. They marched westward, leaving behind tales of people who entered the trail and never emerged. Ethan sifted through archives at the small town library, its shelves heavy with dust and time. Old maps showed how the trail cut through ridges and valleys, always following water sources, always bending around places marked by tribal symbols. Notes from the 1800s spoke of families who set out on pilgrimages, claiming divine visions, only to vanish without explanation. The more he read, the clearer it became. The trail's history wasn't just tragedy. It was a pattern. When he left the library, the sky had turned grey, heavy clouds dragging shadows across the mountains. The air smelled of rain, sharp and electric. At the ranger station, he found an old bulletin board covered in faded flyers. Among them was the one he remembered all too well, Michael's face, printed in grainy black and white, alongside the others who vanished. 6 years had weathered the paper, but the photo still carried his brother's familiar grin. Ethan's throat tightened, his chest constricting with anger at how the town treated these memories like scraps pinned to rot. "Looking for someone?" a voice asked. Ethan turned. A ranger in his 60s stood at the doorway, his uniform faded, his posture rigid. His nameplate read Harlan. "My brother," Ethan said quietly. "He disappeared with the Pilgrims." Harlan studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Some roads weren't meant to be walked twice. Folks forget that." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. "It means you ought to let the dead rest. Digging too deep out here only stirs what's better left buried." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to bury the truth, I'm here to find it." Harlan shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "The truth isn't what you think it is. It's heavier. And once you carry it, you don't put it down again." Without another word, the ranger walked back into his office, leaving Ethan standing there with the weight of those words pressing into his mind. That night, Ethan sat by the window of his inn, rain drumming softly against the glass. The trail had claimed lives for centuries, wrapped in layers of silence and superstition. And now, with whispers of survival trickling back into the world, he felt certain that this story was no longer about the past. It was still unfolding. What he didn't yet know was that the silence was about to break in ways he could never have imagined. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet leaves and the sharp freshness that follows rain in the mountains. Ethan sat at the diner that morning, his notebook open on the counter beside a mug of black coffee. The waitress refilled his cup without asking, giving him a look that balanced politeness with curiosity. She knew he wasn't just another traveler. Everyone here did. He was reading through his notes when a voice behind him murmured low, almost conspiratorial. "You're Michael Miller's brother, aren't you?" Ethan turned to find a man in his 40s, unshaven, with tired eyes, and a nervous tremor in his hands. He wore hospital scrubs under a frayed jacket, and his posture suggested someone who had seen too much and carried it like a weight he couldn't set down. "Yes," Ethan said cautiously. "Do I know you?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line before he answered. "Daniel Hayes." The name struck Ethan like a hammer. Daniel Hayes, one of the Pilgrims, listed as missing, presumed dead. His photograph had been among the faces pinned to that weathered bulletin board. Ethan's voice came out sharper than he intended. "That's not possible. I know what they said," Daniel interrupted. His eyes flicked nervously around the diner. "But I'm not dead. At least, not in the way they think." The room felt suddenly smaller, the conversations at other tables muffled beneath the pounding of Ethan's heart. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Where have you been all this time?" Daniel shook his head quickly, his jaw tightening. "Not here. Not safe to talk here." "People, listen." Ethan swallowed hard, the coffee turning bitter on his tongue. "Then tell me where." For a long moment, Daniel didn't answer. His fingers drummed against the counter, his eyes darting toward the door. Finally, he scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it toward Ethan. "Meet me tonight." Away from town. Before Ethan could press him further, Daniel rose and walked out, his figure disappearing into the grey morning. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ethan couldn't focus on anything but that name, that face, that impossible reality. A survivor. For 6 years he had lived with silence, and now a voice had returned from the void. Yet it wasn't triumph he felt. It was dread. Something in Daniel's eyes had carried not relief, but terror. When night fell, Ethan drove to the address scrawled on the napkin. It was a small clinic on the edge of town, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Inside, Daniel sat on a cot in a dimly lit room, his jacket draped over his shoulders, as if to ward off a chill no heater could touch. "You came," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "You owe me answers," Ethan replied. "Where have you been and what happened to the others?" Daniel's eyes flickered with pain. "They're gone. All of them. The trail. It doesn't let go. Not really." Ethan stepped closer, frustration sharpening his tone. "That's not an answer. My brother was with you. Where is he?" Silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent light above them. Daniel's hands trembled as he rubbed his temples, his words halting, reluctant. "I shouldn't have come back. They told us, warned us, that speaking of it would bring nothing but ruin. You don't understand. Some things aren't meant to be shared." Ethan's chest tightened. "Then why did you agree to meet me?" Daniel looked up, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. "Because the truth eats you alive when you keep it inside. And I've been eaten enough." For the first time in 6 years, Ethan felt the wall of silence around the disappearance begin to crack. But what seeped through wasn't light. It was something darker, heavier, something that carried the weight of a warning he couldn't ignore. The drive back to Richmond felt longer than usual, each mile stretching beneath the weight of what Ethan had just learned. Daniel Hayes was alive, yet broken, his words heavy with warning and unfinished truths. Ethan replayed their conversation in his mind, each sentence like a riddle wrapped in fear. What did Daniel mean when he said the trail doesn't let go? Why speak in fragments? Why hint instead of explain? The questions pressed on him until he realized there was no way forward without confronting the past that tied him to all of this. His family. By the time he pulled into the narrow street where his parents still lived, dusk had painted the sky in shades of amber and violet. The old Miller house stood stubbornly, its white paint peeling in places, the porch sagging slightly with age. Yet it held the warmth of familiarity, a place where voices of memory still lingered. His mother, Anne, opened the door before he even knocked. "Ethan," she breathed, pulling him into her arms. Her embrace smelled of lavender and old books, a comfort he hadn't realized he was starving for. But when she leaned back, her eyes studied him with that knowing gaze only mothers possess. "You've been digging again, haven't you?" "I had to," Ethan admitted, his voice low. "I found someone. Daniel Hayes." Her hand flew to her mouth. "Alive?" He nodded. "Alive, but not the same. He won't tell me everything. Only that the others are gone, and that I shouldn't be asking." Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment he saw hope flicker across her face, fragile but radiant. If Daniel came back, then maybe... Before she could finish, his father's voice cut through the air. "Enough." Richard Miller stood in the doorway of the living room, his shoulders square, his expression etched with the exhaustion of a man who had lost more than he could bear. His graying hair was neatly combed, his shirt buttoned, but his eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had built walls to keep grief contained. "Dad," Ethan started. "No," Richard snapped. "I won't hear it. I told you years ago this obsession would destroy you. You think I don't hurt? You think I don't wake up every night hearing his voice? But there's nothing left to find, Ethan. Nothing that will bring Michael back." The words hit hard, but Ethan stood his ground. "You're wrong. I've seen Daniel. He's proof something happened, something more than a disappearance. Don't you want to know what your son went through?" Richard's eyes burned with restrained fury. "I want peace, Ethan. That's what I want. For your mother. For this family. And you. You keep tearing the wound open. Let him rest." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by Anne's quiet sob. Ethan's chest tightened, guilt twisting inside him, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't walk away, not when answers were so close. Later that night, as he sat in his old bedroom surrounded by remnants of childhood, posters on the walls, books gathering dust, Anne came to him quietly. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand brushing his shoulder. "Your father, he's not heartless, he just can't bear to hope anymore. But me, I need to believe there's still something left of Michael out there. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Ethan said, though even as the word left his lips, he knew it was fragile, almost broken before it was spoken. When Anne left the room, Ethan stared at the ceiling, the shadows stretching long and restless. Family ties bound him, love held him, but the unspoken promises of the dead still pulled harder, and somewhere between those two forces, He knew he would have to choose which weight to carry. Ethan left Richmond before dawn, his car packed with supplies he'd gathered with careful precision, a backpack with food, a map, a flashlight, a worn compass, and Michael's old pocket knife still bearing scratches from their camping trips as kids. As the miles rolled by, city lights gave way to open fields, and eventually to the towering presence of the Appalachians. The mountains rose like ancient guardians, their slopes misted by early morning fog, their ridges catching the first light of day. The closer he came, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just duty or grief driving him, it was the unshakable sense that the answers were hidden within those ridges, waiting for him. Yet beneath that determination ran a steady current of unease. He could hear his father's words echoing in his mind, "Let him rest." But Ethan wasn't ready to rest. Not yet. At the ranger station near the trailhead, he filled out the standard forms for overnight hikers. The ranger on duty, a younger man named Collins, handed him the permit with a look that lingered too long. "You're not going alone, are you?" "I've handled tougher trips," Ethan said flatly. Collins frowned. "That trail isn't like others. Weather shifts fast, terrain's rough, and, well, you've heard the stories." "I've heard them," Ethan replied, tucking the permit into his pack. "Stories don't scare me." But stories weren't his only concern. As he stepped outside, he found Claire waiting by his car. She leaned against the hood, arms crossed, her ranger uniform neat, but her face lined with worry. They hadn't spoken in months, but she looked at him the way she always had, half exasperated, half protective. "You're really doing this," she said, shaking her head. "I don't have a choice," Ethan answered. "Daniel's alive. He saw something. I can't ignore that." Claire sighed, her voice heavy with frustration. "And what do you expect to find? More silence? Another grave no one wants to mark?" "Ethan, you don't understand what you're walking into." "Then explain it to me." She hesitated, eyes scanning the tree line as if the forest itself were listening. "Some trails carry more than footsteps. People who go looking for answers out there, sometimes they don't come back whole. I've seen seasoned hikers break down, convinced they were being followed when no one was there. I've found campsites abandoned, meals half-cooked, packs left behind like someone just walked away mid-breath. It gets inside your head." Her words sank deep, but they didn't dissuade him. Instead, they sharpened his resolve. "Michael deserves better than silence. If there's even a chance I can find what happened, I have to try." For a long moment she studied him, then let out a breath. "Then I'm coming with you." Ethan blinked. "You just told me, I know what I said, but if you're stubborn enough to do this, you're not doing it alone. At least I know the terrain. You'll need that." Gratitude and guilt twisted together in his chest. He wanted to protest, to shield her from the risk, but deep down he knew she was right. He wasn't ready to face this trail alone. By late afternoon they began their hike. The trail was narrow, lined with towering oaks and maples shedding the last of their autumn leaves. The air was cool, crisp, filled with the scent of damp soil and moss. Each step carried them deeper into silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the distant call of a hawk. As the forest closed around them, Ethan felt the first stirrings of unease crawl along his spine. The weight of history pressed on every tree, every stone, every shadow. And though the sun was still up, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was already watching. The forest thickened as Ethan and Claire pressed deeper along the trail. The canopy arched high above them, blotting out the last traces of afternoon light, leaving the air cooler and heavier with the scent of wet bark and moss. The deeper they walked, the more the silence grew. Not peaceful, but tense, as if the woods themselves were listening. Claire paused to adjust her pack, her gaze drifting over the tree line. "Do you hear that?" Ethan frowned. "Hear what?" "Exactly," she said. "Nothing. No birds, no insects. It shouldn't be this quiet." He tried to dismiss the unease creeping into his chest, but he couldn't. It was unnatural, like stepping into a room after a conversation has abruptly ended, leaving only the weight of what was left unsaid. They continued, their boots crunching on the damp ground. After an hour, Ethan spotted something half buried in the soil near the base of a tree. He knelt, brushing away leaves and dirt until a worn leather boot came into view. His throat tightened. The laces were frayed, the leather cracked, but it was unmistakably old. Claire crouched beside him, her eyes narrowing. "Could be a hiker's," she offered, though her voice lacked conviction. "No," Ethan whispered, running his fingers over the boot. "It's been here for years, maybe since Michael's group." The air around them seemed to thicken. Claire straightened quickly, glancing over her shoulder. We shouldn't stay here long. They pressed on, but soon another sign appeared, a symbol carved into the trunk of a maple. Ethan traced the grooves with his fingertips. It wasn't random. 3 interlocking circles etched deeply as if with deliberate intent. I've seen this before, Claire murmured, her face pale. Where? Ethan asked sharply. In old ranger reports. Carvings like this showed up near abandoned campsites, going back decades. Nobody could explain them. She hesitated before adding, some said they were markers. Warnings. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Warnings or not, the symbol meant someone, maybe Michael, maybe Daniel, had been here. His stomach churned with both hope and dread. They stopped to rest near a clearing, the fire of sunset bleeding through the trees in faint streaks of orange. Claire sat on a fallen log staring at the ground. I don't like this, Ethan. The deeper we go, the heavier it feels. Like the woods don't want us here. He sat beside her, exhaustion pressing into his bones. If Michael was here, if he carved that symbol, then we're close to understanding what happened. Her eyes lifted to meet his. And what if what happened isn't something you want to know? The question hung between them like smoke. Ethan didn't answer because he couldn't. The truth was both the thing he longed for and the thing he feared most. As night fell, they pitched a small camp. The fire flickered weakly, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the ground. The silence persisted, broken only by the occasional crack of branches in the distance. Ethan stared into the flames, his thoughts restless. Claire finally spoke, her voice hushed. I had a friend once, another ranger, who swore he heard voices out here. Not echoes, not animals, voices. He quit the service a month later, said he couldn't handle the trail anymore. Ethan felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Voices. Whispers, she clarified, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. Like people calling from far away. But when he followed the sound, there was no one there. Ethan tried to shake it off, but the woods seemed to breathe differently now, the shadows pulsing with quiet suggestion. As he lay down to rest, he kept his brother's pocket knife clutched in his hand, his mind replaying Daniel's warning. The trail doesn't let go. Sleep came slowly, haunted by the possibility that they were no longer walking alone. Morning broke grey and cold, the forest shrouded in a low mist that clung to the ground like breath unwilling to lift. Ethan awoke with stiffness in his shoulders, his grip still tight around Michael's pocket knife. Claire was already up, feeding the fire back to life, her face drawn and her eyes shadowed with the weight of an uneasy night. They ate in silence before setting off again, the trail narrowing into a path hemmed by dense undergrowth. Each step seemed to echo against the hush of the woods, as though the forest carried their presence forward. Ethan couldn't shake the sensation of being guided, or worse, herded toward something unseen. After several hours, they stumbled into a hollow tucked between 2 ridges. The place was sheltered, almost hidden, with the remains of a fire pit surrounded by stones blackened long ago. A few scraps of canvas clung to branches, flapping faintly in the breeze. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. This was no random campsite. It felt deliberate, lived in. Someone stayed here, Claire murmured, scanning the ground. She crouched, brushing away layers of leaves until the outline of a pack emerged, torn at the seams, its straps frayed. She tugged it free and handed it to Ethan. His hands trembled as he opened it, the smell of mold and earth spilling out. Inside were fragments of clothing, a rusted canteen, and at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, edges curled from damp, but the initials etched faintly into the corner made Ethan's breath catch. D.H. Daniel Hayes. Heart-hammering, he opened the journal. The ink had blurred in places, watermarks smearing entire passages, but fragments remained legible. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, the scrawl of a man unraveling. Day 19. Hunger gnaws at us, rations gone. We follow the symbols, though some fear they lead us in circles. Michael says faith must guide us forward. I try to believe him. Day 25. The forest feels alive, whispers at night, not wind. Too clear. They call names. Mine, Michael's. We don't speak of it in the morning, but I see the fear in their eyes. Day 31. A discovery, a place hidden off the trail, sacred, forbidden. They warned us. We shouldn't have seen it. We shouldn't have stayed. Ethan's fingers tightened on the pages, his throat dry. The entries stopped abruptly there. The following pages were torn, ripped out with deliberate force, leaving jagged edges where answers should have been. Claire leaned over his shoulder, reading silently. "He was terrified," she whispered. "Whatever they found, it wasn't just hunger or weather. It was something else." Ethan's jaw clenched. "And someone didn't want the rest written down." They both looked at the torn pages, their absence more haunting than the words that remained. The silence of the forest pressed heavier now, as if aware they had uncovered something not meant to resurface. Claire shifted uneasily. "Ethan, maybe we should turn back. We've seen enough to know it wasn't an accident. These people were led somewhere, and it broke them." But Ethan shook his head, the weight of the journal in his hands anchoring him. "This is proof. Michael was here. He believed there was something worth finding, even when fear surrounded them. If Daniel left this behind, then he wanted someone to know." Claire's voice hardened. "Or he wanted someone to stop." The hollow seemed to tighten around them, the trees leaning closer, the mist curling thick between their legs. Ethan slid the journal into his pack, his decision made. He could not stop now. As they left the campsite, the broken pages haunted him more than the ones intact. What truth had Daniel tried to erase? And what secret could be so dangerous it was ripped from the world, even in ink? The weight of the journal pressed against Ethan's back as they hiked, every step pulling him deeper into a storm of questions. The words Daniel had written burned in his mind, especially the last entry about the discovery, a place hidden, sacred, forbidden. The forest seemed to lean closer with every mile, as if it too carried the secret and resented their intrusion. By midday, they reached a small mountain town tucked against the valley. Wooden houses leaned on uneven ground, their porches sagging under years of rain and snow. Children played quietly in dirt yards, their eyes darting toward Ethan and Claire before quickly turning away. Conversations among adults hushed as the pair passed. "Friendly place," Ethan muttered, his voice edged with sarcasm. Claire's expression was grim. "They know why we're here. People around here don't forget the Pilgrims. They just choose not to speak of them." They stopped at the local general store to restock supplies. The owner, a heavy-set man with weathered skin, eyed Ethan with suspicion as he placed water bottles and trail mix on the counter. "You're not one of them reporters, are you?" the man asked flatly. "I'm just looking for answers," Ethan replied carefully. The man snorted. "Answers? Out here, questions are the problem. You keep asking, and you'll find yourself wishing you hadn't." Ethan's patience frayed. "My brother disappeared with that group 6 years ago. I don't have the luxury of staying quiet." The owner's eyes hardened, but he said nothing more. He shoved the bag of supplies across the counter and turned away as if dismissing them. Outside, Claire pulled Ethan aside, her voice sharp. "You can't push people like that. The more you demand, the more they'll close off. These towns survive on silence." Ethan's frustration boiled over. "And what am I supposed to do? Sit back and let the truth rot in these mountains? Michael's gone, Claire. He deserves more than whispers and warnings." She crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "And what about the people still here? Their lives are tied to this place. If exposing whatever happened means tearing open wounds or violating something sacred, are you ready to live with that?" The question pierced him, leaving him momentarily speechless. His instinct screamed for answers, but deep down he felt the truth of her words. Yet surrender wasn't in him. Not now, not ever. Later that evening, as they lingered near the edge of town, an elderly woman approached them. She moved slowly, her cane tapping against the cracked pavement. Her face was lined with age, her eyes sharp beneath the weight of years. "You're Miller's boy," she said, her voice rough but steady. Ethan nodded cautiously. "Yes, my brother was among the missing." The woman's gaze flicked toward the woods. "Then hear me well. What they sought was never theirs to take. The trail has always been more than dirt and stone. Some things are meant to remain hidden, and those who forget that are swallowed whole." Ethan stepped closer. "Do you know what they found? What happened to them?" Her lips tightened. For a moment he thought she might answer, but instead she shook her head slowly. "The mountain keeps what belongs to it." With that she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan staring after her, frustration and desperation clawing at his chest. Claire touched his arm gently. "Do you see now? Even when they speak, it's in riddles. They won't give you what you want. And maybe that's because it isn't meant to be given." But Ethan's resolve only deepened. The silence wasn't a wall meant to stop him. It was a door he had to force open, and whatever lay beyond it he was willing to face. The night after leaving the mountain town, Ethan couldn't shake the echo of the old woman's words. The mountain keeps what belongs to it. They wrapped around his thoughts like vines, choking his ability to focus. Yet there was one person who might cut through the riddles, the man who had lived the trail and returned. He called the clinic and asked for Daniel Hayes. The nurse hesitated, then gave a reluctant sigh. "He's here, but don't expect much. He barely talks to anyone." Ethan drove back in silence, Claire beside him, arms folded tightly. She hadn't wanted to return, but she came anyway, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of his recklessness. Inside the clinic, Daniel sat hunched in a chair near the window, his gaunt frame swallowed by a hospital gown and a blanket draped across his lap. His eyes flicked up when Ethan entered, recognition sparking before exhaustion smothered it. "You came back," Daniel murmured. His voice was raspy, like every word scraped against his throat. "I need answers," Ethan said firmly. "The journal we found, it wasn't complete. I need to know what happened after those entries. What did you all discover?" Daniel's gaze drifted toward the darkened trees outside the window. His lips trembled before he spoke. "We weren't supposed to see it. The place wasn't ours. They warned us with signs, with silence, but we thought we were strong enough to carry what we found." Claire leaned forward, her tone gentle. "Daniel, what did you see?" He closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking with the weight of memory. "We followed symbols, always thinking they'd lead us to safety. But the trail bent in ways it never should have. We ended up in a valley no map showed. It was untouched, like time hadn't touched it. Stones carved with markings older than the tribes, older than the settlers. We thought it was holy." His breathing quickened, panic threading through his words. "Michael believed it was a gift. He told us to stay, to listen. But the longer we remained, the more it took from us. Hunger grew sharp, thirst unbearable, and the whispers, they were constant. Not wind, not imagination. They called our names, each one of us, promising comfort if we just surrendered." Ethan's chest tightened. "And the others?" Daniel's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "Gone. One by one they gave in. Some walked into the trees and never came back. Some fell silent and stopped moving altogether. I tried to fight it, but the valley doesn't let go easily. It clings to you, drains you until you forget you were ever whole." Ethan gripped the edge of Daniel's chair, desperation in his voice. "But you escaped. How?" Daniel shook his head violently. "I didn't escape. I was allowed to leave. That's different. I was spared because I swore silence. Because I carried their warning back into the world. You don't break promises like that, not to them." Claire exchanged a troubled glance with Ethan, then asked softly, "Why tell us now?" Daniel's hollow eyes locked onto Ethan's. "Because the secret is heavier than I can carry, but once I tell it, it's yours, and you won't be free of it either." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to push further, to demand every detail, but the look on Daniel's face made his blood run cold. This wasn't just fear, it was reverence, a man scarred by something too vast to name. Daniel leaned closer, whispering with finality, "Whatever you do, don't go looking for that valley. If you find it, you'll understand why we were never meant to return." The words lingered in the air like a curse, leaving Ethan with the chilling certainty that he was already too deep to turn back. Ethan drove in silence, the road winding through the foothills, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles whitened. Daniel's warning echoed in his mind, "Don't go looking for that valley." Yet the more he replayed the words, the more they acted not as a deterrent but as a challenge. He had lived in the shadow of absence for 6 years. Now the shadow had a shape, and he could not turn away. Claire sat beside him, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the blur of trees. She finally spoke, her voice taut with frustration. "You're not actually considering it, are you?" "I don't have a choice," Ethan replied, his tone steady but laced with fire. "The valley is where Michael was. If Daniel walked away while my brother didn't, then I need to see why." Claire shook her head, her jaw tightening. "Didn't you hear him? He survived because he stayed silent. If we push further, we're not just chasing answers. We're stepping into something that doesn't want to be disturbed." Ethan glanced at her, his eyes shadowed. "Claire, I've lived half a life since Michael disappeared. Every morning, every night, I wonder if he died alone, if he suffered, or if he believed he'd found something worth dying for. I can't live the rest of my life with those questions. Not when I'm this close." Her voice cracked, softer now. "And what about me? Do you expect me to watch you walk into the same fate, to stand by while you vanish like he did?" The words hit him harder than he expected. He slowed the car, pulling over onto the gravel shoulder, the engine idling as he turned to face her. "I don't want to drag you into this, but I can't stop. I'd rather face the valley and never come back than keep living in the hollow silence I've been in since that day. Claire's eyes glistened, anger and sorrow colliding. You're stubborn to the point of suicide. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. But if you're going, then I'm going too. At least one of us should make it out if things go wrong. Relief and guilt tangled inside him. He wanted to argue, to tell her not to risk herself, but the words stuck. Deep down, he knew she was the only reason he'd gotten this far. They returned to the trail at dusk, the fading light painting the ridges in bruised purples and reds. The path stretched before them, narrower now, tangled with roots and damp with evening dew. Ethan felt the shift immediately, like crossing an invisible threshold, stepping from one world into another. As they hiked, the forest grew unnervingly still. Branches creaked, though no wind stirred. Once, Claire stopped suddenly, kneeling to inspect the ground. Look, Ethan leaned over. Fresh tracks, faint but visible, cut across the trail. Not animal prints. Boots. His pulse raced. Someone's ahead of us, Claire frowned, her voice hushed. Or following the same path we are. Either way, it means we're not alone. The thought was both terrifying and galvanizing. If others had come this far, then the valley wasn't just a rumor. It was real. Night fell quickly, the woods swallowing the last of the daylight. They pressed on with headlamps, the narrow beams carving tunnels of light through the darkness. Yet every flicker at the edge of vision felt like movement, every snap of a twig like footsteps trailing behind them. At one point, Claire whispered, "We should stop. Rest. We're no good to anyone if we collapse." Ethan shook his head. "No, not until we're closer. I can feel it." She didn't argue this time. Instead, she walked silently beside him, her face unreadable, as though she too sensed the pull of something waiting just beyond the line they had already crossed. And with every step, Ethan knew there was no turning back. The forest narrowed into a gorge, the path descending sharply until the air grew colder, dense with moisture. Ethan's breath clouded in front of him as he steadied himself against slick rocks. Every sense told him they were moving into a place untouched, where the familiar rules of the trail no longer applied. Claire walked ahead, her flashlight beams sweeping across the ground, her silence speaking louder than words. After an hour, the gorge opened suddenly, spilling them into a valley veiled by mist. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. The land before them was unlike any part of the Appalachians he had ever seen. Grass grew thick and wild, shimmering faintly with dew, though the night had long fallen. Tall stones rose from the earth in circular formations, their surfaces carved with symbols nearly identical to those in Daniel's journal. Claire's breath caught. "Oh my God!" Ethan stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning the valley. "It's real." The silence here was deeper, heavier, almost vibrating against the skin. Even the forest behind them seemed reluctant to intrude, the tree line stopping abruptly at the valley's edge. Ethan felt a weight pressing into his chest, as though invisible hands tried to hold him back. Claire crouched near one of the stones, tracing the grooves of the carved circles. "These markings, they're old, older than anything I've seen. Ethan, this isn't just a campsite. This is sacred." He nodded, though the word felt too small. This is what Daniel meant. This is where they stayed. As they moved deeper into the valley, they found evidence confirming it. Shreds of clothing tangled in the grass, a broken metal cup near a stone, the faint outline of a fire pit long extinguished. Ethan picked up a charred fragment of wood, his heart pounding. Michael was here. The air seemed to thrum at the name, though he told himself it was only his imagination. Still, goosebumps prickled his arms as if unseen ears had listened. They reached the center of the valley, where an altar-like stone rose above the others. Its surface bore the same triple circle symbol carved deep and deliberate, the grooves darkened, as if burned into the rock. Ethan ran his hand across it, his palm tingling as though the stone itself radiated warmth. Claire stepped back, unease sharpening her voice. "Don't touch it." He turned toward her, his eyes burning with determination. If Michael was here, he stood at this stone. Maybe he believed it meant something. I need to know what he saw. She shook her head. And what if what he saw wasn't meant to be understood? Ethan, look around you. This place doesn't feel abandoned. It feels guarded. Her words gnawed at him, but the pull was undeniable. The valley wasn't just a location, it was a presence. He could feel it in the air, in the ground beneath his boots, in the way the mist clung to them as though alive. As they circled the altar, Ethan spotted something wedged between stones at its base. He crouched and pulled free a fragment of paper, brittle with age but still marked with ink. His pulse quickened as he read the faint scrawl. "We should not have stayed. The air is wrong. Michael says we must keep faith, but faith is fading. I hear them calling. I don't know whose voice it is anymore." Ethan's throat tightened. It was Daniel's handwriting again. Another piece of the missing story. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice trembling. "This valley isn't just history, Ethan, it's a trap. They came here believing it was holy, but it consumed them. And if we stay—" She didn't finish. The mist shifted suddenly, curling in a spiral, as though moved by something unseen. Ethan froze, his instincts screaming that they were no longer alone. And in that heavy silence, he knew they had crossed into the very heart of the forbidden. The mist clung heavier as the night deepened, curling around Ethan and Claire like a living veil. Every sound carried further, the scrape of boots on stone, the catch of breath, as though the valley amplified everything within it. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears, but his eyes stayed locked on the altar stone, on the strange carvings that seemed to shift in the dim light. Claire's voice broke the silence, low and urgent. "We need to leave, now. Whatever this place is, it wasn't meant for us." Ethan shook his head slowly, his fingers brushing the brittle paper he'd found. "Leaving means walking away from the truth. Michael stood here, Claire. He believed in this valley. If I walk out now, I betray everything I came for." She stepped closer, her face pale in the mist. "And if you stay, you risk ending up like him. Do you think you're stronger than the others? Smarter? They were consumed, Ethan. You've seen the journal. You've read the warnings." His chest tightened, the weight of her words battling with the ache in his heart. "But what if Michael wasn't consumed? What if he chose this? If I turn away, I'll never know. I'll never have peace." Claire's hand pressed against his arm, firm but trembling. "Peace doesn't come from tearing open wounds. Sometimes it comes from letting go. Ethan, I've worked these mountains long enough to know when something is sacred, and sacred doesn't mean ours to claim." Her eyes held his, pleading, but Ethan turned back to the altar. His flashlight beam skimmed across more carvings, etched deep into the stone, symbols layered upon one another like generations had left their mark. He imagined Michael here, kneeling in the mist, convinced he'd found something eternal. The image filled him with both pride and dread. The choice burned inside him, to expose this place, to carry its secret into the world, or to leave it buried in silence where it had rested for centuries. The valley itself seemed to demand an answer. The mist thickened, swirling as though stirred by unseen breath. Ethan's skin prickled, the hairs on his arms rising. He heard it then, a faint sound, so soft he almost dismissed it. A whisper. At first it was shapeless, but then it came again, threading through the air, winding around his name. Ethan. His heart seized. He spun, searching the shadows, but the valley stretched empty and still. Claire's eyes widened, fear sharp in her voice. "You heard it too, didn't you?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The sound had been so intimate, so real, like Michael himself had spoken. The temptation clawed at him. Step deeper, listen harder, surrender to the call. But another voice rose in him just as insistent. Claire's warning, Daniel's haunted confession, the ranger's stern advice. He staggered back from the stone, clutching the journal fragment in his hand. "If we publish this, if we tell the world, it'll change everything. Historians, governments, media, they'll swarm this valley. They'll tear it apart." Claire nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. "Then don't. Let it stay what it is, a place beyond us. We can carry the memory without exposing the wound." Ethan's jaw clenched. The journalist in him screamed for revelation, for proof, for closure. But the brother in him, the man who had lost someone to these mountains, knew the cost. Truth wasn't always freedom. Sometimes it was a prison. He exhaled slowly, his decision weighing heavier than stone. Maybe some truths aren't meant to be spoken. Maybe they're meant to be carried quietly. The valley seemed to hush, the mist settling as though appeased, yet Ethan felt no peace, only the burden of choice pressing harder against his heart. The valley lay still, the mist easing but not dispersing, as though it lingered deliberately, unwilling to release them. Ethan and Claire stood at the altar's edge, neither speaking, their breaths shallow against the heavy air. Just as Ethan began to gather his resolve to leave, the snap of a branch shattered the silence. Both froze. Out of the tree line, figures emerged. Men and women in plain clothes, their movements steady and unhurried. They were not hikers nor officials. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence filled the valley with a gravity Ethan had never felt before. One of them, a tall man with iron-grey hair, stepped forward. His voice carried calm authority, like someone who spoke rarely but expected to be obeyed. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan's heart pounded. "Who are you?" The man's eyes fixed on him, sharp yet strangely sorrowful. "The ones who keep this place untouched. Call us what you will, descendants, protectors, guardians. For generations we've ensured the valley remains hidden, and you've crossed into what was never meant to be yours." Claire's voice was steady but laced with tension. "We didn't come to defile it, we only wanted answers." Another figure, a woman with weathered skin and dark, piercing eyes, spoke next. "Answers have a cost. Your people never understood that. Always digging, always taking, never listening. The Pilgrims before you thought the same, and the valley claimed them." Ethan stepped forward, his desperation overriding caution. "My brother was one of them. Michael Miller. I need to know what happened to him." The tall man studied Ethan, his gaze heavy, almost pitying. "Your brother chose to stay. He believed the valley had called him, and once it calls, you do not walk away unchanged." Ethan's throat tightened, grief clawing at him. "So he's dead?" The man's silence was answer enough, but the woman added, "Not dead as you think. The valley keeps its own. His story is here, written in silence, not for you to carry into the world." Claire bristled, her fists clenched. "So what now? You expect us to forget we ever saw this?" The man's eyes narrowed. "We expect you to respect it, to walk away. If you carry this secret beyond these mountains, you bring ruin, not only to yourselves, but to all who guard it. The world isn't meant to touch this place." Ethan's instincts screamed against it. He wanted to argue, to demand proof, to cling to every scrap of his brother's memory. But as he looked at the faces around him, firm, sorrowful, unyielding, he realized they were bound not by fear, but by duty. These were people who had carried silence all their lives, who had sacrificed truth for the sake of something greater. His voice cracked as he asked, "Why let Daniel leave then? Why spare him if silence is all that matters?" The woman's gaze flickered, softening briefly. "Because even secrets need witnesses, but he paid the price for breaking his vow, didn't he? Look at what it did to him." Daniel's hollow eyes flashed in Ethan's memory. A man alive yet burdened beyond endurance. The tall man stepped closer, his tone final. "This is your choice, Ethan Miller. Walk away with what little peace you can, or carry a truth that will consume you as it did your brother. Decide wisely. Because once you choose, there is no return." Ethan felt Claire's hand grip his arm, grounding him. He looked at the altar, at the valley, at the guardians whose silence weighed heavier than any truth he'd ever chased. And in that moment, he understood. Some doors were meant to remain closed, no matter how much the heart ached to open them. The guardians faded back into the tree line, leaving Ethan and Claire alone with the mist and the altar. Their words still pressed like stones against his chest. "Walk away, or carry a truth that will consume you." For the first time, Ethan didn't know what his next step should be. The journalist in him screamed to write it all down, to expose the secret valley, to show the world that his brother's disappearance wasn't random. But another voice, quieter, older, reminded him of his mother's tears, his father's warning, and the hollow look in Daniel's eyes. Claire broke the silence first. "Ethan, you heard them. If you try to publish this, you'll be fighting more than disbelief. You'll be fighting the people who've guarded it for generations. They won't let the truth live outside these mountains." Ethan sat heavily on a rock, running his hands through his hair. "And if I don't, if I bury it all, then what was the point of coming here? Michael's gone, Claire. All I have left is his memory, and this place is the closest I've ever been to touching it." She crouched beside him, her voice softer now. "Sometimes honoring someone means protecting what they gave their life to. Your brother believed in this valley. Maybe the best way to keep him alive is to respect what he chose, not to unravel it." Her words cut deeper than she intended. Ethan pulled the fragment of Daniel's journal from his pack, staring at the smeared ink, the frantic scrawl of a man unraveling. This was evidence, a tangible piece of truth. He imagined it in the headlines, his byline shining with the weight of revelation. But the thought soured quickly. Would exposing it bring closure, or only feed the same hunger that had consumed the Pilgrims? He set his jaw. "I can't destroy everything, but I can't keep it all either. Claire watched him carefully as he gathered the journal fragments and his own notes. With trembling hands, he fed half of them into the fire they'd built earlier. The pages curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash, the smoke rising into the valley like a fragile offering. The rest he tucked back into his pack, preserved but incomplete, truth cut down to fragments, memory kept but never whole. Claire exhaled, relief and unease tangled in her voice. "That's the closest to peace you'll ever find here." Ethan nodded slowly, though the act felt more like surrender than victory. He realized then that closure wasn't about answers. It was about deciding which questions to stop asking. As they prepared to leave, Ethan looked one last time at the altar stone. The mist shifted across its carvings, as if erasing their presence already. He whispered under his breath, a vow meant only for the mountain. "I'll carry him with me quietly, always." The valley remained silent, but somehow the air felt less oppressive, as though it had accepted his choice. The hike back out was slow, every step heavy with the burden he had chosen to bear. Claire walked beside him without speaking, but her presence grounded him, tethering him to the world outside the valley. That night, back in the small inn near the trailhead, Ethan sat at the desk with his notebook open. He wrote, not the full story, not the forbidden truth, but fragments, enough to honor Michael and the others without betraying the silence that guarded them. Words meant not for headlines, but for himself, for his family, for the quiet act of remembering. When he finished, he closed the notebook, his heart heavy yet strangely steadier. For the first time in years, he felt he had stopped chasing ghosts. The truth was his now, not to expose but to carry, and carrying it would change him forever. Back in Richmond, the hum of city life felt almost unreal after the silence of the valley. Cars hissed across wet pavement, neon lights blinked in storefronts, and the air smelled of exhaust and coffee instead of moss and stone. Yet Ethan carried the mountain with him still. The mist, the altar, the whispers that had nearly claimed him. The valley lived inside his memory now, a weight he would bear for the rest of his days. He stood on his parents' porch, the old boards creaking beneath his boots. When his mother opened the door, her eyes searched his face immediately. She didn't need words. She could see something had changed. She pulled him into an embrace, and for the first time in 6 years, Ethan didn't resist. Inside, Richard sat in his chair by the window, newspaper folded neatly in his lap. His gaze flicked to Ethan, cautious, uncertain. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head softly. "Not what I expected, but I found enough." His father studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching. Finally, Richard nodded once. It wasn't approval nor agreement, but it was acknowledgement. A fragile bridge across years of anger and grief. Later, Ethan sat with his mother at the kitchen table. He shared fragments of his journey, pieces she could hold without being crushed. He spoke of Daniel Hayes, alive but scarred. He spoke of the journal, of the signs left behind. But he left out the valley's full truth, the guardians, the whispers. That part he kept locked inside, where it belonged. Anne reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Michael would be proud you went looking, and I'm proud you came back." Her words loosened something in him, something that had been wound tight since the day his brother vanished. For the first time, the ache of loss felt less like a wound and more like a scar, a mark that would never fade, but one he could live with. In the weeks that followed, Ethan wrote, not for headlines, not for readers, but for himself. His notebook filled with fragments, memories of Michael, descriptions of the trail, reflections on silence and truth. He knew he would never publish it, never expose the valley. It was his private act of remembrance, his way of honoring the lost without betraying what they had given themselves to. Claire called often, checking in, grounding him. Their bond had deepened in the valley, forged in fear and choice, and though neither spoke of what might come next, both knew they had crossed something together that would never be undone. Still, on quiet nights, Ethan would step onto his porch and look toward the distant silhouette of the mountains. He would hear the whisper of wind through the trees, and sometimes, just sometimes, it felt like Michael's voice carried in it, not calling him back, not haunting, but reminding him that some journeys don't end with answers. They end with the decision to carry the silence forward. The trail remained, winding through ridges and hollows, waiting for the next soul restless enough to follow it. Its secrets lay untouched, guarded by mist and memory, passed down through whispers that would never reach the world beyond the mountains. Ethan knew he had come closer than most, but not even he had truly touched the heart of it, and maybe that was the point. As we close this journey, remember, some mysteries aren't solved, they're lived, and some truths aren't spoken, they're carried. If you've followed Ethan's story this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are countless other untold stories waiting, and you won't want to miss them. And before you go, click on the suggested video on your screen now to keep exploring the hidden paths of history.